Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out on such a dreary afternoon. We really appreciate your being here. I'm Ariel Kalil. I'm a professor here at the Harris School, and I also direct the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy. Welcome to our annual lecture on the science of success, and we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group. I'm not going to spend very much time on introductions because we're all here to listen to Paul Tough and to listen to our panelists. We have some very nice bios in your programs, so you can peruse those at your leisure. But just a couple of words of introduction. First, the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy is a research and training center located here at Harris. We do a variety of activities, workshops, special events. I'm very engaged with our master's and PhD students both at the Harris School and at the university on questions related to child development, lifespan development, and the intersection of those issues with public policy. Our co-sponsors for tonight, the Human Capital and Economic Opportunity Global Working Group, began in 2010 and is led by the Nobel Prize-winning University of Chicago economist James Heckman. The goal of the Global Working Group, most broadly, is to develop a comprehensive understanding of human flourishing. And in fact, I would say that is also the goal of our center. And so we make a very nice team in that regard. Paul Tough, our special guest here tonight, is a member of this group. And during his 2 years of research for the book that he'll be talking about tonight, he spent time in residence with Jim Heckman's research team in this very building, where he was introduced to many of the ideas that he describes in his book, in particular the role of early life events and the role of non-cognitive skills in life success. As an aside, Professor Heckman sends his regrets that he's not able to be here this evening. He is in China at the moment. So a few words about our special guest, Paul Tough. As you know, he's the author of How Children Succeed, Grit, Curiosity, and the Hidden Power of Character. He's also the author of Whatever It Takes, Geoffrey Canada's Quest to Change Harlem and America. He's a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine and has written extensively in other forums on topics including education, child development, urban poverty, and public policy. We have a wonderful set of panelists this evening who will reflect on Paul's talk and make some remarks about their own work and how it relates to the core themes of Paul's book. I'd like to introduce first, sitting next to Paul Tough, Josh Anderson, who is the Executive Director of Teach for America Chicago. John Gurion, who is at the end of the row here, who is an Associate Professor of Human Development and Social Policy and of Economics at Northwestern University, and also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern, and Diana Rauner, who is president of the Ounce of Prevention Fund. I would like to thank everybody for being here tonight. I must ask you to silence your cell phones, please. And I think, as I said, with those brief introductions, and I hope you'll spend time reading the biographies of our distinguished guests and panelists, but I want to use every precious moment that we have tonight for our speakers. And I'd very much like to welcome Paul Tough and thank him for being here with us tonight.
Hello. I've got two microphones. I just want to make sure they're both working. Can you hear me okay? Great. So thank you to Ariel for that great introduction. Thanks to all of these panelists for, in advance for the words they're going to share. Thank you to the Harris School for convening this and inviting me, and thanks to all of you for being here. So it is a real treat for me to be back at the Harris School and back at the University of Chicago and back in Hyde Park. This is a book, How Children Succeed, is a book about people, and it's a book about ideas, but it is also something that maybe others don't realize as much as people in this room might. It's also a book about Chicago. So much of my reporting, I was just reflecting on this today, so much of my reporting was done within just a few miles of this room. The main place where I stayed when I was doing my reporting in Chicago over the last few years, the sort of nerve center of my journalistic enterprise, was a small dorm room in International House with the shower down the hall. And and from that nerve center, I could sort of go out into the world and gather my information. And part of why this was such a great place to be, apart from the fact that the International House is a great deal, it is that so many of the ideas in the book emerged from the University of Chicago. There's reporting in the book that draws on the work certainly of many in the economics department, also from the Chicago Crime Lab, and from the Consortium on Chicago Schools Research, and many other individuals and institutes throughout this campus. As well, as you know, one of the curiosities of Chicago geography is that when you're reporting on disadvantage, Hyde Park is not a bad place to be situated, not because Hyde Park itself is a neighborhood of high poverty, but because it is surrounded by neighborhoods of high poverty. And so a lot of my reporting was just a few miles away. One of the schools where I spent most of my time was the Ace Tech Charter High School, which is at State and 54th. The EduCare Center, where I first interviewed Diana Rauner, is at 50th and State, just a couple miles away. So in many ways, coming back to this neighborhood and coming back to this school feels like a real homecoming. I started reporting this book in the winter of 2010, and it was a strange period of transition for me. So I had written a book, Whatever It Takes, about the Harlem Children's Zone and Jeffrey Canada. It came out in 2008, and when I got to the end of that reporting, it took me 5 years to report it. So you would think that I would have answered all the questions I might have. But I felt like I hadn't. Part of the effect, I think, of focusing on one guy and one 97-block neighborhood is that there are some things that don't fit into that realm. And so I found myself left with a lot of questions, and kind of big questions about things like how children succeed. What kind of qualities and characteristics tend to predict success in kids, and what kind of environments and interventions tend to develop those skills. Something else happened as I was beginning my reporting, which is that my wife and I had our first child. My son Ellington just had his 3rd birthday. And so that event made all these questions feel all the more urgent and personal for me. So I did kind of a radical thing, which was especially a radical thing to do right after you've had your first child, which was I quit my job at the New York Times and decided to write a book. But I wasn't quite sure what this book was about. But I had a feeling it was going to be set in Chicago. And so my whole family, my wife and our infant son and our dog, all moved to Chicago for a month. And I decided, okay, we'd come for a month, and I wanted to pick the best possible month to be in Hyde Park, so I picked February. There was a lot of walking to the park with our son and just staring sadly at the frozen swings that we couldn't push him on. So from a weather point of view, it was a rough month, but from an intellectual stimulation point of view, it was a very exciting month. When I got here, I felt like I had the question, but not the answer. I knew that the question was how children succeed, but I didn't know where that would lead me. But I had this feeling that James Heckman was going to be a key part of answering that question. He was someone who I had met and interviewed for my first book. I talked to him about the Perry Preschool Project and his work on early childhood education for Whatever It Takes. But then I'd had some more conversations with him after that first book came out, and he seemed to be leading in some new and interesting directions. And as you know, if you've met him, he is someone who pulls from a lot of different directions at once, and that was what I wanted to do. So I decided I would try and apprentice myself to him for a little while. I wish he was here so that I could say this with him in the room, but I'll say it publicly anyway. I really feel like I and this book owe him a great debt more than anyone else. I think he is really the central figure in organizing the kind of thinking that goes into this book. And I had a lot of conversations with him during that month and beyond that month. And I also spent a lot of time going to his graduate lectures. As you know, if you've read the book, I am a college dropout. And if you're a college dropout, going to economics graduate lectures is very challenging. And so when I was speaking with Heckman, I found like about 70% of the time I had no idea what was going on or what he was talking about. But about 30% of the time, I felt like I was at the center of the universe, and that the ideas that he was talking about, the things that we were able to connect, were incredibly exciting. And the first research that really drove me into what this book became was his research on the GED. Some of you may be familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, it was, I think, a turning point in Heckman's career as well. That when he started reporting on the GED, I think he believed, like a lot of economists, that it was cognitive skill that was the key determinant of a person's success, that IQ and success were going to be very much correlated. And so he started looking at GED data, and the GED was, when he started doing this in the late 1990s, even more popular than it is today. It had just had this huge boom. And the idea behind the GED was and is that it is the equivalent of a high school diploma. In some ways, it's a reflection of that idea that I call in the book the cognitive hypothesis, that smarts are really what matter, that if you have all the intellectual ability to get a high school diploma, to pass this test, then you don't actually need to stay in high school and get the diploma. And so he decided to test out this thesis behind the GED, and he found some vast databases and compared GED holders with high school dropouts who hadn't got a GED and with high school graduates. And the first thing he found was that part of the GED thesis was absolutely correct, that GED holders were every bit as smart as high school graduates, that in terms of IQ, in terms of their cognitive skill as measured on standardized tests, they did have all the same intellectual skills. But when he looked at their course through life, they didn't look anything like high school graduates. In fact, they looked almost exactly like high school dropouts in terms of their educational attainment, the chance that they were on welfare, the chance that they had been arrested, the chance that they got married or stayed married. In all sorts of ways, they were living very different lives than high school graduates. The one number that stood out for me was that at age 22, 3% of GED recipients were enrolled in a four-year university or had any kind of post-secondary degree, and 46% of high school graduates had the same. And so where this led Heckman, and then where he led me, was to believe that there was another set of skills that a high school diploma was measuring that turned out to be incredibly important in how a child goes through life. And Heckman's term for these was non-cognitive skills, a very controversial term, especially among psychologists who will point out to you that, in fact, the skills he's talking about are largely cognitive skills. But the name has stuck, non-cognitive skills. In the book, I also call them personality traits or character strengths. But what he found in that study, and what I'm exploring further in this book, is the idea that this set of skills, things like grit and curiosity, perseverance, conscientiousness, optimism, are highly predictive of long-term success in kids, and arguably more predictive than IQ or cognitive skill. So in that same month, February of 2010, just as I was leaving, I met someone else from the south side of Chicago, a young woman named Chiawana Lerma. And she at the time was a junior at Ace Tech Charter School. And I've done a lot of reporting on kids in poverty over the last 10 years or so. And in some ways, her story, though it was sad and dramatic, was one that was familiar to me. She had grown up in intense disadvantage. She had been homeless. Her family had been homeless as a child. Her family was fractured. She had spent some time living with her grandmother, with her great-grandmother, before reuniting with her mother, had moved around a lot. And as a result, she had become a very angry young person. And in 6th grade, what that anger led her to was being sent to the principal's office 72 times. And that led to her being put in a slow class at the Minneapolis school that she was attending. And that slow class was a place where kids were just being warehoused, as I think they are at a lot of schools around the country. She describes, just being given like popcorn and movies and pizza all day and not really taught anything. And so it seemed like a familiar story to me, and I felt like I knew how this story ended, except Chiawana had turned some kind of corner and was heading in a very different direction. In her freshman year at Ace Tech, her GPA had been 1.8, and when I met her, it was 3.9 and rising. And she was in the middle of what seemed to be a personality transformation. She was very much, she had enrolled in this new program that was trying to help her not just get to college, but persist in college. And she was very focused on college. Everything in her life predicted that she would not go to college and would not do well in college. But she did not believe this. She absolutely believed that she was going to graduate. And so I found myself, when I was having that first conversation with her, feeling like there was this connection between these two neighbors, Chiawana Lerma and James Heckman, that there was something in Chiawana's life that could tell me something about the research that James Heckman was doing, and something about the research that Heckman was doing that could tell me something about Chiawana's prospects. And in some ways, that is what the book is about. It is an attempt to find those connections, answer those questions, figure out what Chiawana has and doesn't have, and what that means for her future. At the same time, I was doing some research in San Francisco around stress. I had met this pediatrician, a woman named Nadine Burke Harris, who was in many ways a useful character to me, partly because she was kind of discovering the science of stress at the same time I was, and was guiding me through these complex questions of neuroendocrinology and how allostatic load is created in kids. And partly because she, as a character, was so compelling. She was someone who had a very illustrious academic career, had graduated from medical school, gone to the Harvard School of Public Health, come to this low-income neighborhood in San Francisco called Bayview Hunters Point, and set up this pediatric clinic serving only poor kids. And in some ways, she had a whole lot of success early on. She did what you were supposed to do as an inner-city pediatrician. She increased immunization rates. She gave kids the medicine they needed. And yet, she felt like, in reality, they were surrounded by such stress and trauma, violence and noise, instability, and that was really what was affecting them, that there were things that she could not immunize them against, and that was really what was making them sick more than anything else. So she guided me into this research about stress, and one of the things that I think we've learned about child development, and especially in the past couple of decades, is that there's a lot of important things going on in the first few years of life. But one of the most important is the development of the stress response system. Every child goes through stress, every infant goes through stress, and for most infants, it's a positive thing. They cry, they are soothed, or someone else soothes them, and it's like exercising a muscle. They learn how to calm themselves down. But for kids who are growing up like Nadine Burke Harris's patients, stress for them is intense and chronic. It becomes what doctors call toxic stress. And toxic stress does not have a positive effect on the development of the stress response system. It damages it. And that damage goes on to express itself throughout our lives in terms of its effects on physical health, on mental health, and on the development of the kind of functions, executive functions, that matter a lot in school, from the first day of kindergarten all the way through high school. So the other thing that's been found in this stress research was that there is an antidote to toxic stress, and it is parents or other caregivers. When kids are able to form a close bond with an adult, they're protected to a large extent from this toxic stress. We know this partly from a study that was done at McGill University with rats, where Michael Meany, a neuroscientist there, discovered that there was this one activity, licking and grooming, that certain mother rats did with their pups in the first couple of weeks of life, and others did not. And they did this experiment where they separated the mother rats into two categories, the high licking and grooming mother rats and the low licking and grooming mother rats. They had them raise their pups with a lot of licking and grooming, or a little licking and grooming, for the first couple of weeks of life. Then the rats grew to adulthood, and they gave them a whole series of tests. And the rats who had been licked and groomed a lot as infants did better on all sorts of tests. They were braver, they were more curious, they lived longer, they were healthier, all because of this one behavior that their mothers had done in just the first couple of weeks of their life. And there are researchers who I write about in the book who have found similar relationships in humans. Clancy Blair at NYU has done studies with infants and has discovered that the relationship between the infant and the parent has a huge effect on how the stress response system develops. And this is connected as well, I think, with the research around attachment. And specifically, there's a study that's been done at the University of Minnesota that has gone for more than 20 years, where a group of children, this research started before they were born, where they tracked the relationship between the parents and the children, beginning in the first few days of life, and then looked for how that relationship affected how these kids went through life. And the effects were profound. The kids who had this close attachment relationship as infants did better in school, in kindergarten. They got along better with other children in middle school. They followed them to summer camp in adolescence and watched them get along with peers and not. And the ones who had close attachment early on were able to better negotiate all the complications of adolescent social life. It even predicted, attachment categorization, even predicted graduation from high school 18 years later. And the most important research, I think, around attachment is that attachment style can change, and that we can give interventions to parents who do not have a tendency towards strong attachment that can help them change. There's one study that was done by a psychologist at the University of Minnesota named Dante Cicchetti. And in this experiment, he took 137 families who were at the highest risk of having poor relationships with their kids. They had all been previously cited for maltreatment. They had reported cases of maltreatment with previous children, and now they had a new child, a 1-year-old. And they gave these families this intervention called child-parent psychotherapy, and they worked with them for a year. And at the end of the year, the families who were in the treatment group were transformed. So when you look at attachment, there are two main styles. One is secure attachment. That's what you want for a child. And the other is anxious attachment. And at the beginning, just one of the 137 1-year-olds had secure attachment. At the end of the intervention, 60% of them had secure attachment. And in the control group, that number had gone from just 1 to 2. And this has been tested out in a lot of other places as well, similar interventions. There's one in Oregon that is working on helping parents form closer relationships with their children. There's one in Delaware that works with foster parents and does the same kind of work. And so when I read all this, I was here on campus, and I wondered if there was anywhere within close proximity to International House where this might be happening. And I happened to be talking with Diana Rauner, who runs the Ounce of Prevention Fund. And she said, oh yeah, we're doing that right here. So one afternoon, I drove just a couple of miles away to a home in Englewood and watched as one of the home visitors that Ounce of Prevention had trained did this intervention, where a home visitor worked closely with a teenage mom, giving her the sort of support and help and just attention that would then in turn help her have that kind of supportive relationship with her infant child. So it does seem like there are some interventions that can happen early in life that can increase the chances that children will be successful. The question is, can this also happen later in life? Professor Heckman and I had sort of an ongoing friendly debate while I was spending time here about the principles of journalism versus the principles of academia, and particularly the principles of economics. And our basic dispute was that he felt like evidence had to be absolutely certain, absolutely ironclad, before we could really make any conclusions about what an intervention did. And I, as a journalist, had somewhat laxer standards. I felt like data was very important, but that it could also be limiting, that if we only pay attention to those interventions that have been studied for 30 years by teams of economists, that would limit the information that we have to work with. And a lot of our disagreements came in terms of these interventions with adolescents, because the reality is there is really strong evidence for how important those interventions are in early childhood. The evidence around adolescence and how you can help and whether you can help adolescents develop these non-cognitive skills or character strengths is a little more shaky. There is some suggestive and important evidence that's emerging. From neuroscience, we know, for instance, that the prefrontal cortex, which controls non-cognitive skills, stays plastic much longer than other parts of the brain, which suggests that it would be possible in adolescence to continue to help kids in this dimension. There's a psychological term called metacognition that helps explain how some interventions might work in adolescence as well. Metacognition just means thinking about thinking. And this psychologist, Martin Seligman, who uses this phrase, explains that it is in adolescence that kids first become metacognitive, that they're first able to think deeply about themselves. And as you know, if you've hung out with teenagers, they like thinking deeply about themselves very much. And so some of these interventions that I write about in the book take advantage of that and use that tendency of teenagers to help them change their habits, change their pattern, change their thinking. Most recently, a few scholars at the University of Chicago, Sarah Heller, Jens Ludwig, and others, published a paper on an intervention in a Chicago public school called the Becoming a Man Sports Edition. Not an awesome name for an intervention, but that is the name of the intervention. And they found some very positive effects of what is essentially a mentoring intervention with hugely at-risk adolescents. They found positive effects in school and outside of school. But all of this evidence is still pretty suggestive. It is not up to the Heckman standard. I think it's heading in that direction, but it's not quite there yet. But this is where journalism, I think, can be useful. You can actually go and look at a program and talk to people and talk to the people who are running a program, the people who are involved in it, and ask them questions about how they think it is working. And that is what I did with Chiawana Lerma. So I ended up, after that meeting with her 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago, following her through her whole next year of school at Ace Tech, her senior year, as she was taking her ACT again, as she was applying to colleges and trying to find out whether there was a college for her out there. The program that she was enrolled in was called One Goal. And One Goal is a relatively new program here in Chicago. It's now in 23 high schools in the Chicago system. It's a 3-year program in junior and senior year of high school and freshman year of college. The same teacher sticks with those kids through those 3 years. And they try to give them the kind of training and support that will help them not just get into college, but persist in college, graduate from college. It is its intellectual basis comes from another University of Chicago scholar, a woman named Melissa Roderick at the Consortium on Chicago Schools Research, who has found some remarkable correlations between these non-cognitive skills and college graduation. I think, like a lot of people, had thought of college as sort of the ultimate intellectual pursuit. But what Melissa Roderick has found is that, in fact, when you talk about persistence, the kids who persist, especially at big public colleges, the kids who persist are the ones who have these non-cognitive skills, things like grit and perseverance. And so it's this that One Goal is trying to develop in these students. They do ACT prep as well. They try to increase their ACT scores, and they are able to boost them by 2 or 3 points, moving them on average from being at the 15th percentile when they start their junior year to about the 35th percentile. So still quite low, but better. And once they get better, they have access to a wider range of colleges. They also work with them on what the founder calls the roadmap to college, just helping them with the nuts and bolts of figuring out, if you're the first person in your family to have gone to college, how to choose the right college, how to apply for financial aid effectively, how to get along with a roommate, how to interact with professors, how to go to office hours. All that information is intensely helpful when those kids get to campus. But I think at the heart of this intervention that Chiawana was enrolled in is this idea of non-cognitive skills, that they're trying to help kids recognize in themselves that they have these non-cognitive skills. They call them leadership principles. That every day, growing up in neighborhoods like Roseland or Englewood, they are exhibiting resilience and resourcefulness and ambition. And that if they can turn those skills toward this one goal of college graduation, they can actually accomplish that and graduate in serious numbers. And so I watched as Chiawana went through that process, and her ACT scores never got that great. Her final ACT was a 15, which I think puts her at the 15th percentile. But she worked extremely hard in her junior and senior years, and her GPA when she graduated was above 4.0, and she was admitted to Western Illinois University. And everything about her ACT score would predict that she would not do well at all at Western Illinois. In fact, it would predict that she shouldn't be anywhere near a college campus. But in her freshman year, she did fantastically well. She worked extremely hard. She sacrificed, she focused, she bugged all her professors from the first day of class to the end. And she graduated, or she finished her freshman year with a 3.8, and she's back now for her sophomore year. And in her cohort, 85% of the kids who started in their junior year of high school are persisting in college today. And in Chicago public schools, as the consortium has shown in a report, just 8% of kids overall graduate from a four-year college. And for kids like those in One Goal, who are mostly first-generation college students, mostly low income, mostly in high-poverty neighborhoods, that percentage is actually much lower. So here's where we are, I think, with this question of how children succeed. There is a lot of promising and suggestive evidence out there that if we focus in this dimension of non-cognitive skills or character strengths, especially at these two periods of life, in early childhood and in adolescence, we could have a profound effect on how well kids do, especially kids who are growing up in disadvantage. So I think the message to practitioners is that this is a great place to experiment. We certainly don't have all the answers yet. There is no one curriculum that any school can take off the shelf and give to their students to teach them grit and perseverance. But there are a lot of methods and techniques and ideas out there that seem like they should be tried even more. And so I think the message also to scientists and to scholars is that we need your help as well. We need to understand better exactly what works. We need to understand the interaction between biology and education. We need to understand the interactions between stress and attachment and trauma and school success. We need better data. We need more information. But I think it's an immensely important direction to head. We really can't wait to gather this information because it's too important. Especially the college data suggests that if we can make the kind of transformation in lots of kids' lives, lots of Chicago public school kids' lives that Chiawana was able to make, we could not only change the lives of children, the outcomes for whole families, but we could change the situation in whole neighborhoods in Chicago and around the country. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for your time.
I'll just use this. Can you hear me all right? Terrific. So my name is Josh Anderson. I serve as the Executive Director of Teach for America here in Chicago. And I've been in this role leading our regional efforts here for about 6 years. And prior to that, was a teacher in New York City in the Hunts Point community. And so I want to share 3 thoughts with you as I reflect on Paul's book. I do want to just preface this all by saying I found this to be a thrilling read, and I really loved the book. One, because of the challenging message I think it has in it for education reformers. And second, I rediscovered some important people in my life in this narrative, whether it be Dave Levin or a guy named Thomas Brunzell, who was the Dean of Discipline at KIPP Infinity in New York City. He's the guy at Summer Institute when I first showed up for my boot camp who taught me classroom management. Or Jeff Nelson, who is the co-founder and CEO of One Goal, who is a close personal friend and someone who I went through the core with at the same time. And to see each of these people's reflections written in such a generous and provocative way was really powerful. So my 3 thoughts. First thought, is this message of the need to focus on the non-cognitive resonated deeply on how I now look back at my own experience as a teacher. And to put it bluntly, it underscores what I now realize was probably my greatest blind spot, or perhaps my greatest shortcoming as a teacher. So I taught 5th and 6th grade English and social studies, and for a new teacher, I was a pretty good teacher. In my first year in the classroom, my students made, in reading, 1.6 years of growth on average. And before they got to my classroom, they were making somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5 years of growth every year. And in my second year in the classroom, my kids made over 2 years of growth. And, you know, now I'm 7 years removed from that journey. And I've had the opportunity to keep up with my students and to see where their paths have led. And what's been fascinating is the story that Paul relates of Dave Levin thinking about the first class of Kipsters at his school in New York. My teaching was nowhere near as good as Dave Levin's, to be very clear about that. But that experience really resonated with my own, which is while my kids had really begun to catch up in a meaningful way, in a purely academic way, in the course of our time together, a lot of the kids, and a lot of the kids who had made the greatest gains in a purely academic sense, had fallen pretty seriously behind or fallen off course as I checked in on them later. 2 students come to mind. Malik, who came into my classroom, my 5th grade classroom, reading at a 1st grade level and made over 3 years of growth. He stayed with me after school 3 days a week. I was on the phone nearly every night, or at least a couple times a week, with his grandmother, who was his primary caretaker. And Malik went from barely being able to read to really being, close to a 4th grade level by the time he left my classroom. That was pretty impressive growth. And I really was one of the students who I was most proud of our work together. And today, 1, I can't track him down. 2, I know he's not doing so well, just from talking to his friends, and he's clearly on the verge of dropping out. I then think of Paula, and Paula, made more incremental growth. She was closer to on grade level. She was only a couple years behind by the time she reached my 5th grade classroom. But she made more incremental growth, but I know she's doing very, very well, and she is very much on track to college. And it was certain skill sets that she had, primarily just a dogged determination, a conscientiousness that I know have continued to serve her well, regardless of the environment she is in. So on the first hand, the story and the challenging message of the need to focus on not just the academic aptitudes of our kids, but who they are becoming from a character sense, resonated deeply. Second thought. It reminds me of an organizational journey we've had over the last few years at Teach for America. And it's what I'll call the journey towards the idea of transformational change. And so a few years ago, a bunch of us started about 5 years ago, a bunch of us started visiting our top tier 1st and 2nd year teacher classrooms. And lo and behold, they looked a lot like my classroom looked, as I related to a few minutes ago. It was an orderly place. It was a place where kids were learning a lot of content, working hard. The teacher was talking a lot, or sort of really driving the work in the classroom. But a lot of academic growth was happening. And we all sort of through a series of conversations came to this joint reflection that something was missing in these classrooms. While kids were making 1.6 or 1.3 years of growth, they were making a lot more growth than they typically would be making. We were wondering about a very simple question, which was, is their trajectory, their life trajectory, is their academic pathway any different as a result of this experience with this core member? And I think the unsettling answer we were coming to in our gut was unclear. And in a lot of cases, the evidence would suggest no. And so this was sort of a spark that led us as an organization to say, there were a number of stimuli or impetus for this process, but this was a main one, to say we need to re-articulate our core values that live at the center of the decisions we make. And the first core value we articulated through this now then multi-year process was this idea of transformational change, which was the idea that we were going to assess our impact in any situation, not purely in a numerical way, but also by asking the simple question and gathering appropriate evidence to sort of give us a good answer about, has our work with this student, whether it be through an alumni who has become a school leader or a principal, or a core member who's in their second year in the classroom, has our impact, has our work with this student led them does it give us good reason to believe they're on a meaningfully different trajectory in life? So have we had a transformational impact versus what their demographics would predict? And so I'll fast forward to how this core value and trying to live it out. It's a very challenging value to live out, but how it has changed the way we interact with our teachers. Now, as we go into classrooms, of course, we do still believe very strongly the purely academic side of this matters a lot. But we don't assess a teacher's efficacy at the end of the year just by looking at their NWEA data. So, okay, this teacher made 1.7 years of growth. That's great. That puts them at the 85th percentile of teacher effectiveness. We also look at two further things now, and we coach them on this throughout our time with them. The first is the enduring traits and mindsets we see in evidence in their students. So are the character traits that Paul enumerates in this book, are they in evidence in the habits that have been instilled that kids have learned over the course of the year? And if they're not, we know, we believe very strongly, there is a serious risk that the progress will erode or will be short-lived. And the second thing we look for in addition to the academic is the partnership with parents. Is there a partnership with parents, or has that parent been activated because the parent, or whether the primary caretaker at home, Malik's grandmother, has she been activated to care for him or to be the advocate for his education that she needs to be? And so we're paying a lot more attention to that and tracking that. Finally, I know there's a sign up here saying stop, so I will share my third thought, but I'll try to do it quite briefly. My third thought is, I think Paul's book, for some reason it had the effect of, he doesn't say this explicitly, but it had the effect for me of, I think, pushing us, or among many other voices out there, pushing us beyond what I think has become quite an unhelpful dichotomy in the world of school reform. And that is the dichotomy between poverty and teacher quality, right? We know that kids from low-income backgrounds, like the south side of Chicago or the southwest side of Chicago or the west side of Chicago, face many, many greater challenges as a result of the circumstances in which they grow up. And then we give them substandard education, and they make less progress than their peers in other places. And the achievement gap, which was in evidence from the day they set foot in our schools, only grows over time. And the school reform movement has become this debate in some ways, and I think you saw this in the public debate over the teacher contract that just played out here in Chicago, has become this debate between, do we try to fix what's happening at home, or do we try to fix what's happening in the school? And the reality is, if you counterpoint that narrative with what Dave Levin did in the chapter or the section of this book that describes Dave Levin's reflections on the first class of Kipsters, what he did was he actually totally saw beyond that dichotomy. He said, okay, the outcome I care about is my kids succeeding in the long term in life. And then he had the flex, and he centered himself in that question. He said, what do I need to do to make sure I meet their needs? What does it mean in terms of the culture, the time, the structure, the curriculum of the school I'm creating for them? But also, what does it mean in terms of the partnerships I create outside of my school? And so he's our best educators. I think the Noble Street schools here in Chicago illustrate this point with incredible clarity. The best schools in our midst and our best school leaders are totally ignoring this dichotomy we seem to be totally stuck on. And I think in this way that this book is a very helpful push to people within the education reform movement. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Diana Rauner from the Answer Prevention Fund, and I think that I have both of my microphones working, so I'll hope that's working. Well, I first wanted to just, I could not help but say how fitting it is that we are here at the Harris School, named for probably the individual who's done more to promote the concept of attachment, Irving Harris, than anyone else, both in terms of supporting research, supporting programs, and policies to promote attachment between children and parents, and in many different kinds of programs. You know, I think what is so compelling about Paul's book is that he's really sort of talking about transformational change at two really critical points in life. Early in childhood, really at the point of the beginning of life, and then at this very, very critical point in terms of both another explosion of brain development, but also an explosion in change in children's trajectories. What we do at the Ounce, of course, is focus our attention on both of those critical points at the same time, and that's really the power of prenatal and home visiting programs, and programs in center-based programs that work with parents and children at a very, very early age, and really from even before the children are born. And I'd like to just contrast situations. It's hard not to think about the contrasts, because many of us who are parents understand the extent to which we have been thinking about what our children will be and become even before they're born, often before they're conceived. And most of us come to that with a strong sense of our own self-efficacy, a sense of our own security, and a knowledge that the way we were parented probably served us pretty well, and if it didn't, we sort of understand what we might want to do differently. And when I think about some of the moms that we're working with, many of them are young women who have not had a trusting relationship. They have not in their own lives had anyone who they really felt was there for them. Young women like the woman who's portrayed in Paul's book, and some of the young women that we see in our home visiting and doula programs who have been left unsupported by the institutions that they have attended, who have not had parents who have been able to support them, and they enter into even the idea of parenting without any sense of their own capacities. And so the description that Paul gives in the book of the way that home visitors work really through relationships to first instill a sense of love and unconditional support in mothers. So it isn't really about teaching mothers how to parent. It's about helping parents, young parents, both women and men, understand their capacities for love, for support, their capacities to become leaders in their children's lives, to become the parents that their children need them to be. And we know how important this is for parents to transform their own sense of themselves. It's one of the reasons that the doula program that we start with, the prenatal program, begins having parents narrate having moms talk to their bellies about what they would like to do for their child, what they hope and aspire to for their child. And of course, we do tell the parents how important it is that their child actually learns their voice. But really, that's all cognitive therapy for the mom. That's really about mom being able to develop a vision for herself of who she wants to be for her child. And then the home visitor's role, the doula's role, is to provide the support to help that parent know that she can do that. This is the same kind of work that we do in our center-based programs. This is what really high-quality early childhood programs can be. They are transformational for both the trajectories of children and for parents. For children, of course, as Paul's book describes, there is a pretty well articulated description of how stress and the role of good parenting, as well as chaotic life situations, affects children's capacity to develop both stress response systems and a functioning prefrontal cortex. One of my favorite researchers, Roderick Whitesburg, always says, emotion drives attention and attention drives learning. And the fundamental challenge with toxic stress is that it disrupts the capacity to regulate emotions, which therefore force children into situations when they cannot focus their attention on learning. We see that in teenage kids, we see that in very, very young children, we see that in kindergarten children. And it has been proven, again, through research that in fact that's probably more predictive of children's academic performance even than their verbal skills or their math skills. I want to make a shameless plug for another talk that's going to happen in a couple of weeks here. Clancy Blair, the researcher who's a star of Paul's book, is coming to speak in a lecture that will be sponsored by the Ounce and by the Center for Human Potential and Public Policy here. And I think he has a very elegant way of describing the ways that good parenting mediates the toxic stress, the chaos, the trauma of young children's lives. And I think the other piece that I really want to stress is trauma. Some of the studies that Paul mentioned are studies with parents and children who are repeating trauma that they have experienced in their own lives. And having truly therapeutic and supportive, attentive, high-quality early childhood environments and high-quality early childhood experiences are the ways that we begin to interrupt that trauma and repair it. So we always talk in our work about change happening through relationships. And I think one of the things that's clearly a theme throughout Paul's book is the essential nature of relationships. They are, first of all, unequivocal in their support. And very, very importantly, and this is, I think, a similarity with both home visiting and the One Goal work, they meet the young people, the parents or the teenagers, where they are. They start with where they are. They're aspirational, but they don't set standards that can't be met. And they are long-term. When I think about 3 years, it's a magical number for us because we talk about continuity of care in the first 3 years of life and building really strong attachment relationships. And I think it's kind of interesting that in One Goal, they also have a 3-year program, and that continuity of relationships is so important there as well. So I want to stop with just a brief appreciation, really, to Paul for changing the dialogue. I'm one of those psychologists who gets very angry when I hear about non-cognitive skills because, of course, as we know, it's all happening here. These are not happening in the gut. And I've tried to correct Professor Heckman, but I'm not sure I'm going to succeed. But I do think it's really important to understand the absolute interaction between these social, emotional experiences that happen actually deeper in the brain, in the amygdala, and the cognitive functions, both the executive functions of impulse control and working memory and flexibility, but also the cognitive functions that allow us to do well on tests and to persist in tasks. That all of those things are deeply interrelated, and we really cannot, in any situation, whether it's teaching or learning or in our programs, we really cannot separate them. We can't evaluate children separately, and we can't evaluate teachers separately. So thank you.
Hello, I'm John Gurion, and in addition to all the affiliations I have at Northwestern that Ariel nicely mentioned, I'm also an affiliate of the University of Chicago Crime Lab and faculty director of the Urban Education Lab. The reason I mention that is I want to talk about a couple of studies that a group of researchers at both of those organizations have been involved with. Both of them are aimed at answering the question of whether there are cost-effective policies and programs that could build non-cognitive skills or social cognitive skills, as I like to maybe call them, among adolescents and help children succeed. They're both evaluations of interventions that are based on cognitive behavioral therapy in some way, as Paul mentions in the book, and both are set up as randomized controlled trials where kids are randomly chosen from some population from an eligible group that we choose to either to be offered to participate in the program or to receive the program or to receive some status quo set of services. So the first is a study called, as actually Paul referred, Becoming a Man Sports Edition, which I actually was not involved in the study, but Sarah Heller, who's right over there, is one of the authors of the paper, along with Jens Ludwig and Harold Pollack, who are both professors here at the University of Chicago. This was a program that was implemented by Youth Guidance, as a social service agency in Chicago, and World Sports Chicago in 18 Chicago public schools on the south and west sides of Chicago. In the study were about 2,700 7th to 10th grade boys. About 70% of them were African American and 30% were Hispanic. Just to give a sense of the population we're talking about, they had an average GPA of about 1.7. They missed about 25% of the days of school during the previous school year, and about a third of them had already been arrested. I won't go into too much detail because I don't have too much time, but the basic idea of becoming a man is that there's one class period a week. They engage in this curriculum that's based on cognitive behavioral therapy, and then after school they participate in non-traditional sports like archery and boxing. And the program is aimed at this idea that Paul talked about, metacognition. So the idea of thinking about thinking and learning to think about how your thinking leads you to behaviors that end up with getting you into bad situations. More specifically, impulse control, anger management, sort of future orientation, all these things that are these social cognitive skills that the book is about. And the study found that the kids who were randomly chosen to be offered the program experienced about a 40% reduction in their rate of arrests for violent crime and for non-violent, non-property crime, most of which are drug arrests. So there was this decline in arrest rates and an increase in school engagement. So a combination of attendance, grades, and not dropping out. So this has all happened in the year that the program was implemented. The next year, actually, after the kids were no longer in the program, the effect on violent crime arrests faded away, although the school engagement effects stuck around, they persisted. The second study is a study that actually Sarah's also involved in. This one, I am part of the team working on it, is a study that's taking place at the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center, which is essentially the juvenile jail in Chicago. It's the largest juvenile detention center in the country. Has about 500 beds. In 2007, the federal courts took over the detention center in response to a civil rights case that was brought by the ACLU, and the federal courts appointed an administrator. The administrator decided that he wanted to implement a curriculum that was based on cognitive behavioral therapy to try to build social cognitive skills for the youths that were spending time in the detention center. And so what he did is he split the 500-bed facility into about 10 50-bed residential centers. And he started switching over one residential center at a time from the sort of status quo to this cognitive behavioral therapy intervention. When he had gotten about halfway through, the unions who represented the staff at the detention center sued and got a temporary restraining order to get him to stop, because in order to implement the program, he had to hire staff that he could train in this, and he had to hire more skilled staff. So there was this period for about a year and a half where half of the detention center was implementing this program that was building these social cognitive skills, and half of the detention center was doing what it had done before. All of the kids actually go to school, so this is something that I hadn't focused on until we sort of spent some time there, but these are kids who are school age. They're about 13 to 17 years old. So inside of the detention center, there is a Chicago Public Schools school. So they spend time there going to school, but during the time when they're not in school, the status quo, you should sort of picture them sitting around watching television, and the staff is sort of trying to make sure that they don't hurt each other. And this intervention, during that time, they were engaging in cognitive behavioral therapy, basically. The average stay for a kid who goes into the detention center is between 3 and 4 weeks. And these are kids who are awaiting trial, so we have this setup where half the kids are getting one thing and half the kids are getting the other, and it turned out that the administrator of the detention center decided to randomize when a kid enters the detention center, whether they go to the
the sort of old style status quo residential centers or the cognitive behavioral therapy centers. And this is very preliminary, we haven't even written this up, but the very preliminary results, we're finding a reduction in recidivism rates among the kids who spent those 3 to 4 weeks being exposed to the cognitive behavioral therapy and this metacognition training. And the reductions are about 10 to 15% of the average recidivism rates among the control group. Now, both this intervention at the detention center and the Becoming a Man intervention, when we do cost-benefit analysis, so we sort of try and calculate what are sort of the value of all the benefits that the kids are getting from, like the reductions in crime rates, the increases in school engagement, and compare those to the cost of the program. Both are clearly cost-effective. So our estimates of cost benefits relative to costs are anywhere from 3 to 30 times. So the benefits are about 3 to 30 times the costs. Now, I think at this stage we need more research about so taking as given that these non-cognitive or social cognitive skills are very important. I think we need more research about what types of interventions might be effective at building those skills. And I think we also need to try to understand not just whether these programs work, but why they work, because I think that'll help us to maybe develop programs that are more efficient, more effective, and do they work in other settings and for other kids? But at the very least, the results of these studies and some other things that we're working on are very encouraging, and so I hope people continue to do research like this.
So I was wondering, since you said that there's a lot of good evidence for early childhood intervention, how do you actually make that last in a cost-effective manner? Because there's also many studies show that there can be a peak, but then it fades once the early intervention is over.
So this sounds like
Sounds like me.
any and all of the people
So-
up on the stage could.
So what's interesting about the fade out, and there is quite a lot of chatter about the fade out in major studies like the Perry Preschool or Abecedarian or even the Head Start studies, there is, those studies really focused pretty exclusively on cognitive skills, IQ, and other measures of cognitive skills. What's interesting about all of those studies is that they all show that the treatment group, even many, many, many years after their experiences, had higher graduation rates, were more likely to be employed, less likely to be arrested, more likely to be married, more likely to own their own home. Basically all the things, they're good life outcomes. And so I think it's pretty well established in the developmental literature that there are habits of mind, character traits, effects on social emotional skills, however we want to describe those things, that actually do persist and in fact have great impact on long-term life trajectories. What's also clear is that when kids go from high-quality programs to low-quality schools, that's a crime. We shouldn't let that happen. And so it's really critical that that high-quality early education programs are followed up by high-quality schools.
Anyone else on the panel like to add to that? Or thanks.
Well said.
Next.
So my question is for Mr. Anderson. Mr. Tuff asked the question in this book, what makes children succeed? And from my close friends and colleagues that have participated in Teach for America, both as teachers and in several instances also in management and administration, have related to me that your organization has spent a lot of time thinking about what makes teachers succeed. And it seems actually like there's a lot of symmetry in some of the characteristics that I know that your organization collects data on for potential teachers, that it then examines later, looking at what types of characteristics correlated with a successful teacher, and that a lot of them sound kind of similar: grit, resilience, willingness to take on a challenge in the face of extreme barriers put in front of someone. So I guess I was kind of wondering, this is really more of an observation, but I was also just wondering if there was if you would notice that symmetry, and if any of your research on what makes a successful teacher is influencing how you're thinking about what to tell your teachers when they enter into a classroom about promoting non-cognitive skills in their own students.
Okay. It's a great question or observation. The first thing let me just sort of say a little bit about how we think about the qualities of our most effective teachers, both in terms of what we look for on the front end, so in the admissions process, and then what we try to instill and support our teachers to do once they're in action or in the classroom. So on the front end, you're absolutely right. So what we've done, we have this sort of really fascinating set of data that's over a decade now, that sort of runs over a decade, where we have two sort of sets of data that we line up and then run a simple set of regression analyses. The first set of data is our sort of quantitative scoring of the actual academic growth that happened in the teacher's classroom. And then the second is what that person looked like on our admissions rubric on the front end, and on any number of different dimensions and variables. And we, starting 8 years ago, lined those things up and built a predictive admissions model aligned to what things on the front end predict success once you're in the classroom. So what we found, first, sort of counter to sort of the point of symmetry, actually, the biggest, most predictive competency was academic achievement. But actually not necessarily, though, because that was telling us they had just incredible critical thinking skills or anything like that, but just for the simple reason, actually a past record of success predicts future success. So that was one. But then, and the key thing to understand, though, is that this is a model, and the competencies are meant to work together, not be understood in isolation. Because just someone with a high GPA, if they don't have the rest of the things I'm about to enumerate, doesn't succeed, actually. We know that pretty clearly. So one is a record of achievement, academic success. The second thing we look for is perseverance. And we actually have then a separate competency called grit. So perseverance is actually, do you actually, it's a specific mindset. It's, do you, when in the face of challenges, do you actually try to focus on the things you can control and increase your effort actually against the things you can control? Then grit is just, do you give up? And we hope, you don't give up. Then fourth thing we look for, so achievement, perseverance, grit, critical thinking. So we actually sort of have a set of data and problem-solving exercises where we're looking for people's problem-solving ability. The next thing we look for is ability to influence and motivate others. But what we're not looking for is charisma. What we're instead looking for is an ability to listen and then tailor a message that is actually persuasive. And then finally, we're looking for people with big heart, like people who actually really, really want to do this. And then the last thing we look for is organization, how organized you are and how your ability to actually stay on top of things, efficiently sort of manage your time ends up being hugely, hugely predictive. But what's, again, really important to understand is these things working in combination, not any single isolated competency, is what predicts people's success in the classroom. Then I will just say, so that's one body of research, so that I don't drone on for too long. Just the second body of research we have that's, I think, pretty interesting is just we do a very simple, again, we have a different advantage, not that we're journalists, but we aren't, we don't have to hold to sort of standards of peer review and whatnot. We can sort of follow sort of initial sets of data, subject them to tests, and say, okay, this is good enough for us. And because we're just trying to make organizational decisions. We do happen to think they're consequential, but anyway, we do a simple analysis called a bright spots analysis, which is over many, many years, we spend a lot of time in our most effective teachers' classrooms. And we try to say, what are they doing in common? And what we've realized, was the title, actually, of a book that we published 2 years ago called Teaching is Leadership. And the idea was that our best teachers did the things that great leaders do in any context. They're very clear about setting a bold and inspirational vision. They spend time, tons and tons of time, effectively motivating kids and families to want to work towards the goal. They plan, use time incredibly strategically. They use data to inform instruction. They work relentlessly, and so on. What's interesting about that, though, is what the Teaching is Leadership model very much captures, and I think what we weren't seeing in evidence in our classrooms a few years ago, was that second piece, like how you motivate kids, actually matters immensely. So the idea of what was happening in my classroom, which was effective in a near-term sense, which was me being at the front of the classroom, through sheer force of will, making kids learn, that's not an effective long-term strategy. And so what we realized is that motivation strand, or investment strand as we call it, is deeply, deeply important, and there's more nuance there than we realized. And so when we look at classrooms now, we have many orders, sort of a hierarchy, which is, at a baseline we want the classroom culture to be compliant on task. Then we're looking for kids that are interested and hardworking. But in our best classrooms, what we're noticing is a classroom culture that is best described as passionate, urgent, and joyful. And what is so, so clear is that it's children's zest and sort of inspiration and their own determination that is driving the classroom.
Thank you. Lindsay.
So we hit on this a little bit in people's discussions, but being at the policy school, I wanted to get people's take on something that you write about in the last chapter of your book, which is how poverty policy discourse has largely become subsumed into education reform discourse. And I found that really interesting and really sort of a powerful thought, and I would love to get the opinions of our illustrious panel.
So, I mean, this makes me think of the point about in education policy discussions, there seems to be this false sort of choice between, either the schools can solve everything or they can't do anything because of what's going on in the kids' lives outside of school. And I think, my personal view is that neither of those is true, but that also if you don't recognize the situations, things that are going on in kids' lives outside of school, you're not going to be as effective in school as you would otherwise. And I guess, as evidence that the story of you can't do anything if, because of the situation of kids' lives, as evidence that doesn't seem to be true is, the studies that I just mentioned. We're working with kids who have very, very troubled situations when they get to us. And even with interventions that are not that costly, we can move outcomes. Now we don't, take a kid who's very disadvantaged and is involved in the juvenile justice system and turn them into a college graduate like that, right? So, but policies, to be cost-effective and worthwhile, policies don't have to solve the entire problem. They just have to do more good than they cost us.
That's a really important question and a hard one. I guess from the early childhood perspective, I would say that the critical role of context and of the context of children's lives is kind of where we have to start and finish. And there really is, especially in early childhood, because children don't actually self-locomote even at the beginning, there is really no child outside of the context of his family and really out of the context of his community. And so thinking about ways in which their programs can catalyze and support parents in the really, really complex task of navigating through the many, many stressors that they have in their lives, but also trying to think, I think, about the ways in which we can also help parents focus on their children's development in the context of everything else that's going on. It's certainly the only strategy we have. I don't know if it really answers the whole question.
Did you want to add to that?
Sure. The only thing I'll add, and I wrote that chapter, so you know what I think. But the only thing that I'll add is that in pointing out that those two debates that were very separate back, say, in the '60s, became conflated. I wasn't arguing for separating them entirely. I think there were a lot of good reasons that they became attached, at least, and that is that, I think we've really learned how powerful education and other interventions in childhood can be in reversing poverty in really significant ways. That this basic model that kids can, through education, achieve great things, and then can, in the process, sort of transform a neighborhood, transform a family. That, I think, is a really powerful and true model. I just think that there's something lost in the conflation, and that is just that it has diminished our ability to look at poverty incisively, I think. And I think that the closer that we can focus on poverty, both in the classroom and outside of the classroom, the more we're going to be able to look at interventions that are going to help kids in the classroom and outside of the classroom.
Here in the front in the white shirt.
Thank you. This question is for Mr. Tuff, but feel free to answer any of the other panelists. But from your research, what was the most effective way that you saw classroom teachers instilling these values on their students, mostly in an adolescent classroom?
Well, so I'll just say as a preamble that I think it is still an unanswered question in my book, what teachers should do, and often when I'm, over the past couple of months, been speaking to teachers, I find they get very frustrated by that fact in my book and in terms of what I say. I don't think we know yet exactly how to do it. But I do think, to me, probably the most powerful example that I've seen is in one-goal classrooms. And I don't exactly know how they do it. I've watched them a lot, and I think there's a way of motivating kids, convincing them that first convincing them that they have these skills, not presenting them as something that's someone else's skills that they have to develop, but showing them how they have resourcefulness and resilience and ambition and professionalism in their lives already, and then talking about them a lot. And I think part of that talking is something that's pretty similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. I don't want to get too broad in terms of a definition of that, because I know that cognitive behavioral therapy is an actual thing with an actual definition. But I felt in my reporting that I kept seeing it everywhere, that there was something, especially in adolescence, about having those sorts of conversations with kids, whether it was in discipline conversations at KIPP schools, whether it was in programs like the ones that like Becoming a Man, or whether it was in one-goal classrooms, or whether it was in the chess team that I followed, that there's something about that going back and forth between an adult and a child, often a teacher and a student, but not always, that I think just is immensely transformational, potentially transformational. And so I think that's a lot of what those one-goal teachers were doing.
Question?
I don't know who to direct this to, but I read an article, I believe it was this week in the New York Times. I read an article this week in the New York Times that the United States has dropped to, I think it's about 13th in terms of college graduation rates. And we used to be second, and I'm wondering if there is a cultural shift that's going on in general in the United States in terms of the development of these qualities in young people.
Well, I can talk about that a little bit, those college graduation rates, because I do write about them in the book, and the numbers are really striking. The United States was, in fact, first in, I think, 1995, and I think we're now 16th in terms of college graduation among OECD countries. Mostly that's about other countries. That's about other countries. Many other countries over the past 15 years have put intense emphasis on college graduation and have really transformed their educational systems to the extent that they're graduating millions and millions of new students and just increasing those percentages very quickly. The American percentage actually has gone up slightly during that period, but much more slowly than other countries and much more slowly than it had for the previous 100 years in the United States. So I don't think that I don't think it's a cultural shift in terms of the importance of college. During that same period, when you ask kids, including disadvantaged kids, whether they want a college degree, they say that they do. I think the numbers, I may have this wrong, but I think it was 40% in either 1980 or 1990 said they wanted a college degree. Now it's 80%. And the reason that they say that, I think we can surmise, is that a college degree is much more valuable than it was before. College degrees are, the college wage gap is much bigger than it was 20 and 30 years ago. So there's this conundrum here that all these other countries are moving ahead. Kids want college degrees. College degrees are very valuable, but they're not getting college degrees. And so my theory in this book, and it's a theory I'm borrowing from lots of other scholars, is that a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're not focused enough on college persistence, and that college persistence has a lot to do not just with the kind of skills that get measured on standardized tests, but with these character strengths or non-cognitive skills. To me, so I write about all that as my introduction to the chapter about one goal. And I'm not saying that one goal is the answer to all of those problems, but I think it is pushing in the right direction. It's part of why I think it's such an important intervention, because I think it's potentially important not just for not just for the kids enrolled in it, but in terms of this really significant change that's happened in our international competitiveness that I think will affect the next 100 years of American history. So that's a lot of pressure to put on one goal. But I do think, but I think they can't do it alone. President Obama has said that by, I think, 2020, he wants the United States to be the #1 country again in terms of the highest college graduation rate. I think that's an awesome goal. I hope that he realizes that he has an enormous amount of work to do. Well, first he has to get reelected, but then he has an enormous amount of work to do to make that happen, because those kids that he wants to have, higher graduation rates than Korea and Finland and all these other countries whose numbers have gone up so high, they're like in like middle school now. And so if we want them to be graduating on the same numbers as the Koreans and Finns and French and everyone else, we need to do some serious rethinking both of the path to college and the path through college for millions and millions of kids.
John, did you want to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. So just to reemphasize something that Paul said, that this is an incredibly important problem, and because of the fact that the value of a college degree is higher than it's been in maybe ever, and certainly in a very long time. And this is linked to the idea, one of the most fundamental changes in the economy over the past 30 years has been the increasing income inequality that's happened. And that's very directly linked with the idea that the returns to education have gone up over that time period. But as economists will tell you, this is about supply and demand. And so part of the reason for the increase in inequality may be that the supply of college graduates hasn't kept up with the demand. So it's both a problem, and if we could increase college graduation rates, it could be a solution to an even bigger problem. There would be more college graduates, the supply would increase relative to demand, and that could help to reduce inequality. That's something that's been this troubling change in the economy. The other thing I would say is that while I completely agree about the role of non-cognitive skills in explaining this change, there's another thing that's been happening, which is that funding for higher education has reduced, both funding for community colleges, but also just the fiscal condition of states. And so some of the support services that might have otherwise been there for kids who are in community colleges maybe aren't there, and capacity of community colleges hasn't grown as much, and so it's much harder to sort of make your way through community colleges, which is where a lot of the change in graduation rates has happened. So.
Yes, in the front.
I'm not sure who this goes to. Can you talk about some pragmatic and short-term ways? Can you talk? Is it on? Can you talk about some pragmatic and near-term ways of introducing this research and the findings that you're all talking about so compellingly into the national discussion about teacher evaluation, and our national obsession with test scores?
Short-term ways to introduce that into that conversation. I mean, I think it is. I hope that it's part of that conversation. I think it should be more a part of that conversation. My sense is that I feel like the way we think about tests is pervading the education system right now. But I think federal policy over the last 12 years has had a big role to play in driving that. And so I feel like some changes on the federal level would be useful. I feel like Race to the Top is in some ways a brilliant law in terms of how it leveraged federal money to change laws in lots of different states. But I think if it turns out that those changes were not beneficial to the long-term success of kids, then it becomes a less brilliant law. And that's definitely my concern with that law. So I would start there with federal policy, with what's going on in the Department of Education. I sometimes hear promising things that this is something that they're thinking about now and that they're questioning some of the ways that they've been pushing. But I think it's a hard train to stop or to redirect, that there is now, I think, an immense amount of momentum behind this in different states, different cities, and nationally. And I'll just say one other thing, which is I don't think it's just a policy change. I think it is also just a question of how we think about those tests, how teachers think about what they're doing in the classroom, how principals think about it. But I do think it would require a policy change as well.
I have a couple simple thoughts. First is I would take you back to the moment in the book about Dave Levin's reflections on that first class of Kipsters. And actually it'd be interesting if schools were actually held accountable not just for their year-over-year test score gains, but longitudinal outcomes. So what happened to kids after they graduate? That is not a hard, I mean, that data exists, and it's not an impossible thing to put into a school accountability framework. So that would be one idea. I mean, schools ought to be accountable, if you're a high school in particular, for the percentage of your kids that enroll in a four-year college and the percentage of kids that persist after 2 years, the percentage of kids that graduate from a four-year college. Those are knowable things. That data exists, and it's something we should be holding schools accountable for, I believe. The second is, so one way, so my first thought, I guess, really is to come at the puzzle in terms of thinking of the school as the unit, not necessarily the individual classroom as a unit. Because I think things get a lot trickier if you're trying to link an individual teacher to longitudinal outcomes of their students. And I don't think that's a good idea or a good road to go down. But the second thought I have is sort of, again, in a near-term sense, not an impossible idea to introduce either one as part of your observation rubric, sort of search for student behaviors that are linked to student characteristics or character traits that are going to serve them well. The other thing I will just say is, to me, and as an organization, I don't think the focus on test scores per se is deeply problematic. I don't believe that. As a teacher, I found it actually to be the case that me getting my kids to grow on those assessments was about teaching very fundamental things. And I would just say that these two ideas of the cognitive and the non-cognitive, should be mutually reinforcing. So I don't personally, and I think the tests, I do think we all need to push for the tests to get better and more sophisticated and more sensitive. But I don't find the insistence on people being held accountable for the progress students make in their care. I find that to be an absolutely positively essential idea.
Can I just add one other thing, which is to follow up on what you're saying? You're not, in terms of looking for one small change that the way you're describing, this isn't maybe a small change, but it's smaller maybe than changing the entire schools education system. Not only are high schools right now not held accountable for college graduation rates, but colleges aren't held accountable for college graduation rates. And I think we just don't think about it that way. We don't really think that it's the responsibility of an institution to graduate their students. I'm sure individual institutions think that way, but I think we mostly think about college as an option, and we think that when students drop out, that's their decision. And there's a certain amount of truth to that, but I also think there are things that schools, that colleges could do, that public universities could do, that community colleges could do, that would be much more focused on saying our job is not just to give instruction in the classroom, our job is to create graduates. And we could build incentives into the system, but we could also, I think, just change the culture of how higher education thinks that the goal is really about diplomas.
Sorry, I will add one further thought that builds on that, which is just that our best high schools in the city, like we actually have some really fascinating transformational schools in the city of Chicago. Say there are about 30. We have 680 schools, so we don't have enough, clearly. But the best high schools, and again, I'll cite the Noble Street Charter School Network as an example here. They now have 13 campuses. They hold themselves accountable for the college graduation results of their students. They track it, and they take actions on the basis of what is happening, what they're learning.
Okay, the gentleman in the white shirt in the front.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the early versus late intervention because I think there is something that is a little bit more fundamental than just an academic versus journalistic distinction. And I would call it like a sense of priority for policy, in the sense that especially in a period like of tight budget, and we know that many of those programs rely on public budget, like what the economic analysis of those programs is allowed to understand is that the rate of return of early programs is usually higher than the rate of return of what Heckman calls remediation programs that are done later. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the level of the capacity of those programs to actually provide good results is not present, like that the late remediation are useless, but relatively to early intervention are less effective. And if we want to invest on something that is more or less achieving the same outcome in the long run, we would like to invest on something that is more effective than less effective, especially if we do not have much money. And this is, there is a lot of research, even complicated on that, but it's very intuitive in the sense that if you invest early on someone, you are likely to not need remediation later on that same person. If you miss the early intervention at the beginning, then you might need a program of remediation after. So it's basically like you are eliminating one need by intervening earlier.
So I'd be happy to take a shot at answering that. And I've mostly been feeling sorry that Professor Heckman is not here today, but now when I give this answer, I'll feel glad that he's not here because I'm going to kind of question a big premise of his. And so, I totally take his point, and it is foolish to argue with Professor Heckman, especially on that point. I do think that his basic point about the importance of early interventions, how they lead to success later on, makes a lot of sense. But I do think that it partly depends on the programs that we've looked at. And I think we don't have enough information yet. I think that some of the later remedial programs that we've looked at, absolutely are ineffective. And most of the ones that he's studied, Job Corps and things like that, the outcomes are really crummy. But I do think, and again, I'm looking at this from a journalistic point of view, when I look at one goal, for instance, I find it, my guess and certainly my hope is that if at some point someone from the University of Chicago decides to study the effectiveness of one goal, my guess is it's going to be extremely cost effective, that it's a $1,400 a year program. And the reason I think that it can be so effective is that adolescence is this period where kids are making decisions, making choices that are transformative in their lives. That if they decide one thing, to go to college, to graduate from college, they're going to have one kind of extremely productive life. If they decide another thing, to drop out, to get pregnant, to commit a foolish crime that gets them involved in the criminal justice system, they are going to very quickly go down the wrong path. And so I do think that it's possible, at least, that moment is potentially a very cost-effective place to intervene. And if one goal's numbers hold up, and if for $1,400 a year we can move the college graduation rate for kids in this program from 4 or 5% to, I'm sure it won't persist at 85%, but to 40%, I can't run the numbers. I'm sure someone in this room can. That seems like it's going to be an extremely good investment. So while I certainly don't question the premises of this, I think it's possible that it's a question of not having enough data. And if we look at some of these more creative, more, I think, potentially powerful interventions later on, we may find that they are just as cost-effective as some of those early interventions.
John, do you want to give us the economist perspective on this question and some of your own?
Sure, right. So actually, we are talking with one goal about doing a randomized controlled trial eventually. So
that's thrilling. That's great.
Yeah, I hope that happens because the answer is if they had effects the size that you mentioned, it would definitely be cost effective. You'd have to add zeros to the ratios that I talked about. But I guess the one thing I would say is I actually don't think it's as obvious from the research as the question implied that we should be devoting all resources towards early intervention and nothing towards later intervention. It certainly is true that there are a bunch of later interventions that haven't been shown to be effective, but I could name others that have. I mean, so for instance, the return to staying in college, going to college, is incredibly high. So I guess I would just caution against the idea that we know that we should only be intervening early because the returns are so much higher. I also don't, I think that, again, it's sort of a false choice. While it is true that there are limited resources, I don't think that the answer would ever be that we would only intervene early and not intervene late. Rather, there should be some balance, and how the balance works should depend on what the relative returns are. But I don't actually think that there's quite as much evidence that suggests that this is a settled point.
I guess I would just say one thing, which is that from a biological standpoint, I think we've got some pretty good evidence that investing early certainly makes a longer difference in lifespan, for one thing, because those habits are reinforced. But it doesn't mean by any means that anything is hopeless. I mean, one of the premises of our home visiting program is that, in fact, becoming a parent is also a critical moment. Often these are adolescent parents. And so I think no one would write off individuals at any age. I think the sad truth is that we are so underinvested as a country in early education and early programs that it's kind of hard for us to make a large-scale conversation about where things belong. Whether we're so far from a place where every young child in poverty, or even every young child in the darkest and deepest kind of poverty, is getting the kind of early intervention that he or she needs, that it's hard for us to talk about this truly scientifically, I think.
I'm getting the stop signal here, so I'm going to bring our evening to a close with two things. First, I'd like to thank Paul Tuff and all of our wonderful panelists for a engaging and stimulating and thought-provoking evening, and especially a special thanks to Paul for championing these ideas in the public sphere. I mean, it's so amazing to be driving home and listening to This American Life and hearing you and hearing Jim Heckman and hearing all the lions of developmental psychology being discussed. That's so wonderful, and I'd like to thank you for that and that service that you're doing and for being here tonight. And I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask you the final question.
Okay.
And it really stems from the fact that many of us have read both of your books, we've read your magazine articles, and I'd really like to know what's next for you.
I'd like to know that as well. My current plan is to focus on child development in a different way, which is to hang out with my 3-year-old a lot for the next few months, who I am sadly not seeing much of this fall. But in terms of what I'm going to write next, I'm just not sure.
Well, we will wait in eager anticipation. Let's have a round of applause.